to episode 3 of Great Moments in Orchestral History. It's my pleasure that today, compared to the other two, we get to look at a third century of music making compared to the other two examples we've looked at thus far. Ives is looking forward and doing a lot of inventing. He's a composer, and with this piece in particular that is dear to my heart because I just finished my doctoral project focusing on this composition. So in part I was interested in because of how difficult it is, and now although it's from a different period, the piece is 100 years old at this point, yet it still feels very contemporary to me in terms of its style, its complexities, and the challenges that they pose to musicians. More so than to audiences, because I think the piece is really something that people can get a sense for and relate to, but it's a piece that is rather stressful to prepare and to perform. Unlike the other two pieces that I've looked at thus far, not so much funny stuff going on here with this piece. This is a piece that is very personal to Ives and is also very complex in terms of what it's trying to say about humanity, or what it could be trying to say about humanity, and is also it's out there. So it's kind of almost incomparable in terms of how it relates to other orchestra music, which makes it fun to talk about. So who was Charles Ives? Well, I think it's fair to consider him a modernist, partly in terms of the timing of when he was alive. He didn't really have any musical peers in the United States for a number of reasons. First of which was he didn't really rely on musical composition for an income. He was an insurance salesman. Not only a salesman, he basically developed the techniques for what is now life insurance as we know it. So he was very successful in that regard, and was known as an entrepreneur, and so his colleagues were similarly successful, but in domains outside of music, which was something that was not so common or accepted for people in his social circles or in that period. So he was really an outsider, even though he was like a business insider. That success that he found in business gave him the flexibility to compose whatever he wanted, free of any economic incentive to do something that would be successful. That being said, he certainly did have peers, especially in Europe, because around the same time you're looking at Arnold Schoenberg, who is developing all these new techniques for composition, and Ives is doing a lot of the same thing at the same time. Not the same thing, but is interested in a lot of similar ideas in terms of moving beyond inherited traditions. Well, what is a modernist, and what are they moving beyond? Well, personally, I feel like in composition and in art, there became a point around the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century, where in terms of art with the Impressionist movement, music with late Romanticism and the tone poems of Richard Strauss, that you're getting to sort of an end point. Composers such as Bruckner, Strauss, and Mahler are finding that they're doing things that are about as big as possible in terms of sheer size and volume and ambition. You can say the same thing about other arts, that you're really getting up to the limit in terms of what you can do using the techniques and the instruments and so forth that you inherited by the people that came before you. So that sort of pushed a lot of artists and a few composers at this point in time to develop new paths. What does it mean to be an American composer? There isn't really an example at this time for somebody who's done so successfully. So really, if you wanted to develop an idea of what it is to write American music, to be successful as a composer, he really doesn't have a clear example of whom to follow or who might mentor him in that regard. So that's another reason why, although Schoenberg is revered and studied in a lot of institutions, Ives kind of becomes this loner who is somebody who is just doing things on his own. They're not, unlike Schoenberg, they're not necessarily getting performed a lot. So, like Johann Sebastian Bach, Ives is a composer whose performances and whose fame have grown and spawned after his lifetime. And we see that with Three Places in New England, because it wasn't performed for 15 years or so after it had been written, and even then it had to be changed to be performed for the first time. So for me, as somebody studying him, since there are so many different versions that he had to make of this piece and so many different possibilities as to how to make it work, there's a lot of things that I was able to study and to look at. So today I'm pleased to share some of those things with you. When I think of Charles Ives and Three Places in New England, I'm reminded of the film A Beautiful Mind, which depicts the mathematician John Nash, who, like Charles Ives, is somebody who's extremely brilliant and an innovator in his field, but both people have some difficulties or challenges in relating to others or to their profession, I guess in the case of Ives, the musical side of his profession. And with Nash, we see somebody who is a brilliant mathematician who later on would become recognized for his discoveries. But in that movie, we see him being portrayed as somebody who struggles to and seeks to come up with a mathematical way of explaining human behavior and nature, essentially. Something that is completely impossible. And with Ives and Three Places in New England, we see him trying to represent moments in his life and in the life of others who live in New England. So the third movement from Three Places in New England is titled The Housatonic at Stockbridge, being the Housatonic River where it meets the town of Stockbridge in western Massachusetts, in the Berkshires area. And just before the music, we see he provided an excerpt from a poem by Robert Underwood Johnson, who, like Ives, was a transcendentalist poet of New England who lived and worked a little bit before Ives, but was a big inspiration for him. And so there's that poem. We don't necessarily know, just by looking at the score, how Ives relates to that poem or to that specific location, but tangentially we are provided with a quote from Ives as he reminisces on his honeymoon to this area with his wife. And he wrote, "We walked in the meadows along the river and heard the distant singing from the church across the river. The mist had not entirely left the riverbed, and the colors, the running water, the banks, and elm trees were something that one would always remember." So it's pretty incredible because, as I was referring to in the movie A Beautiful Mind, it's impossible to scientifically or to mathematically depict nature. But that is essentially what Ives is setting out to do in this movement from the piece. So at the beginning we have this sort of murmuring that we can, or I assume, represents the flow of the river, which is very gentle. It's not very deep at this point. So you have very simple rhythms underneath, and it's almost like the violin line above it represents the untamableness of nature. Untamable in that, like, how do you play like, 10/16 notes in the time of 3/8 notes. That is, on the verge of mathematically possible. And then how do I, the conductor, get a group of violins to do that at the same time and in relation to what the other musicians are doing? So that's one of the great challenges of this piece. And given its mathematical complexity and the fact that these musicians are freaking out probably, although it's my job to get them as ready as they can be, and to put them in a place where they can just make the music. Despite that, the piece, it sounds peaceful, this moment. So I'm going to let you listen to that, the river music, and then the emergence of the church hymn on top of that. So with this piece being the topic for my doctoral project, I wanted to do some legitimate research regarding it, and to make a contribution to people who might also want to interpret and prepare this piece. So I set out to Stockbridge, Massachusetts about a year ago in the summer, and in wanting to recreate that experience that Ives described with his wife, I decided to go on a Sunday morning so that it might be theoretically possible for me to hear that church choir singing adjacent to the river. And I also wanted to identify places that would have been in existence 100 years ago. So I did identify Ice Glen, this hiking area, just sort of southeast of town along the river. And I also identified a church, the Episcopal Church, that seemed like the closest church in proximity to any point in the river or a point where you might walk. That was about 0.8 miles for me to get from one to the other. And granted, when I was hiking around, I think I was maybe heard a little bit of a church bell, some sounds from town, but basically that would have been it. And the town was pretty busy, had plenty of people driving through, but didn't really hear any of that. And then as I walked into town and got to this church, the church's doors are wide open and the choir is singing. But even then I could only hear that choir singing when I was basically within 50 feet of the church. It's not like Ives is pulling one over on us. It's just that the piece, I don't think is necessary. I don't think his memory is a memory of one moment where all of these different things were happening simultaneously. I think this piece for him is a reflection of what he remembers, and certainly with the time having elapsed from from when he was there to writing this piece, he might remember that a little bit differently, and what he might be nostalgic for and recollect is the total of his experiences there, being newly married, being with his wife, their hike there, the beauty of the river, the beauty of the church choir singing that hymn, the town itself, anything else that might have happened there for them. So I think that in this regard, he's sort of setting a collection of experiences. And in that way, he's really populating his music as one of three places in New England, this combination of things. So Ives definitely has multiple things going on simultaneously in the second movement, which is called Putnam's Camp. It's actually the one of the three places in New England that I haven't personally visited, but it's not as relevant since it's not so much the location that's interesting as it is the way in which he populates the location with multiple soldiers and marching bands. The title refers to, there's a General Putnam who was stationed there with his soldiers during the American Revolutionary War. Then Ives adds another layer to the composition by having this scene be imagined by a living 4-year-old boy, a young boy that he imagines going to this location, and the boy imagining what it would have been like back then. Let's listen to a moment where you hear a whole bunch of different sort of tunes of that era and marching band tunes going on simultaneously. So as you hear there, what's interesting is that Ives' music is not all of the different musics that we're hearing simultaneously, but the combination of them in this creative, imagined way that it could have been back then, and through the added perspective of a boy imagining this stuff, which becomes a little bit more apparent in the way that those tunes sort of come in and out of focus during the second movement. So there's that moment where it sounds like a lot of sort of recognizably American sounds, and so what does he do with it? He sort of just, perhaps this is part of the boy imagining it all, but he sort of just accumulates into this like huge ending, which is capped off with like a tiny little bit of Star Spangled Banner in the last few seconds of the music. So once again, what does that all say? It's complex, and that's up to you to interpret. There's certainly, I think, something patriotic that he's doing in representing this time and all of this music adding up to something that is certainly ambitious and grand and exciting. And I think that when we performed it, there was even an added perspective and another time that was added into the performance, because during our performance, the performance was so exquisite that Ives himself, he's dead, so like the ghost of Ives visited us and decided to mess with the power in our concert hall for a few seconds while we were playing like the loudest part of the piece. So you can see that, or not see it, since it gets dark. But it was quite a bit of fun, and so we'll take a look at that, and then also the ending of the piece with the Star Spangled Banner. So what could it be that Ives is portraying with these different locations? We see in the third movement the natural surroundings, the church sounds, the personal nature of him on his honeymoon. Then in the second movement we hear something more historic and recognizably patriotic in terms of the musical content, and relating to the American Revolutionary War. And then in the first movement, so moving backwards here, it's definitely the most serious in tone, and I think yet again Ives is in total showing a lot of things that are of importance to him. And we know that that his family was pro-emancipation and involved in some opportunities for people in that regard. So it's not a surprise that in the first movement he's honoring the contributions of the 54th Regiment, which a regiment of African American soldiers that was able to fight in the Civil War. Something that we also see depicted in the movie Glory. And in that movie they actually show the promenade of these soldiers going down central Boston towards their deployment and their missions in the South, and it sounds very celebrative. You know, there's all these people celebrating them and confetti and like a marching band. In Ives, though, he has his own interpretation of this departure of the 54 Regiment, and I think that for him, he's sort of considering the totality of their mission and this whole experience of race relations in the United States, perhaps, and the fact that half of the soldiers lost their lives. It's not as clear as in the other movements, but we do know that some of the things that he's borrowed from are spirituals. So in that regard, perhaps he's representing the voices of the fallen soldiers through that history and through that tradition. So it's very somber music. It contrasts with the chaotic and exciting second movement, and then the more personal to Ives third movement. And the title of the movement is the St. Gaudens, which is the sculpture at Boston Common that memorializes the 54th Regiment and its leader, Colonel Shaw, for their contribution to the Civil War. So with this third installment of Great Moments in Orchestral History, we're looking at 3 places in New England. And to me, what's amazing about this piece is not necessarily how momentous it is. It's not as momentous as Beethoven's Third or other large pieces that are out there. But what makes it an amazing moment in orchestral history is its ability to convey simultaneously things that are of a location that we can relate to here in the United States and feels American, both in terms of places we can go, things we can hear, in terms of the various musics that it includes. Like we know Yankee Doodle, we know the Star Spangled Banner, and it's also incredibly personal, which is probably the initial reason in why I got interested in this piece, is just the beauty of that third movement, and it's just something that I wanted to decode and to figure out what is this, and how is it made, and how can we perform it, because it's not easy, and that, you know, lots of people shy away from it, and so it's just I think it's an incredible moment for the number of things that it's interested in, and they all interest me, and so please feel free to check out a recording of 3 places in New England. I recommend mine, and see you next time.